Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through one of the most remarkable stories in English history, the life of Alfred the Great, the only English monarch ever to bear that magnificent title. We'll softly explore how a youngest son, never meant to rule, became the saviour of his people against the most fearsome warriors of his age, the Vikings. From his birth in the peaceful village of Wantage to his legendary victory at Edington, from the darkest hour when all seemed lost to his transformation into England's greatest king, this is a tale of courage, wisdom, and the unbreakable human spirit. Now, before we begin this soothing journey together, I want to share something special with you. I know many of you are wonderfully shy and gentle souls who listen quietly but hesitate to leave comments. But you know what? Your thoughts and feelings about these stories matter so much to me. Whether it's just a simple "loved this" or "Alfred was amazing," or even just an emoji that shows how the story made you feel, every comment brings such joy to my heart. Think of our comment section as a cozy fireside chat where quiet voices are the most welcome. There's no need for long thoughts or perfect words. Just share whatever feels right to you. Maybe tell me which moment in Alfred's incredible journey resonates with your heart, or simply let me know you are here with us tonight. I promise this is the gentlest, kindest corner of the internet, and your voice, however soft, adds something beautiful to our community. And of course, if you'd like these peaceful, historical tales to continue flowing into your evenings, a gentle subscribe would mean the world to me. Each subscription tells me that these quiet stories are finding their way to hearts that need them. So cozy up now, pull your blankets close, and let these gentle whispers from 9th century England carry you toward the most restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. You belong here, and your presence, whether silent or shared, makes our little corner of the world a warmer place. Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great, entered this world at a time when darkness was gathering across the English lands. The year was 849, and in the royal estate of Wantage, nestled in the rolling hills of Berkshire, a child was born who would one day stand as the last hope against an invasion that threatened to sweep away everything his ancestors had built. Picture, if you will, an England very different from the one we know today. There was no single English kingdom, but rather 4 great realms that shared this island. Wessex in the south and west, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, and Northumbria stretching to the Scottish borders. Each kingdom had its own king, its own customs, its own ambitions. Yet all shared a common heritage, a common faith, and increasingly a common enemy that was gathering strength across the North Sea. The child born that autumn day was the 5th son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex, and under the customs of the time, he seemed destined for a life far from the throne. His older brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, Ethelred, and Ethelstan, stood between him and any chance of kingship. This youngest prince could look forward to perhaps becoming an ealdorman, governing a shire, or leading armies in his brother's service. But the crown itself seemed an impossible dream. Yet even in those earliest days there were signs that this child was marked for something extraordinary. His mother, the noble Osber, daughter of Oslak, the king's cupbearer, possessed a deep love of learning that was unusual for the time. In an age when even kings could barely write their own names, she ensured her youngest son was exposed to poetry, stories, and the precious art of reading from his earliest years. The story is told, though it may be legend wrapped around truth, of how young Alfred, perhaps 6 years old, was shown a beautiful book of English poetry by his mother. The manuscript was illuminated with gold and bright colours, its pages filled with the heroic verses that told of ancient kings and mighty deeds. "To whichever of my sons can learn to read this book first," she promised, "I shall give it as a gift." While his older brothers showed little interest, Alfred was captivated. Day after day, he would stare at those mysterious marks on the parchment, until finally he had memorized every line, every word, every syllable. When he recited the entire book perfectly, his delighted mother placed it in his small hands, and with it, perhaps, planted the seed of the scholarly king he would become. But learning alone would not save England from what was coming. Across the Whale Road, in the fjords and kingdoms of Denmark and Norway, a storm was building that would soon break upon these peaceful shores with unprecedented fury. The Viking raids had begun decades before Alfred's birth, like summer thunder rumbling on a distant horizon. At first, they seemed no more threatening than the occasional raids that had troubled Britain's coasts for generations. A monastery sacked here, a coastal village burned there, terrible for those who suffered, but hardly enough to threaten the stability of kingdoms. The first recorded Viking attack on English soil had come in 793, when the monastery of Lindisfarne, that beacon of learning and faith off the Northumbrian coast, was destroyed in a savage assault that shocked all of Christian Europe. The scholar Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne, captured the horror in words that still echo across the centuries. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Such a voyage was not thought possible. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God. But Lindisfarne was far from Wessex, and the raids that followed seemed random, uncoordinated. Raiders would appear with the spring winds, strike like wolves, and vanish back across the sea with their plunder before any organised response could be mounted. They were a problem, certainly, but not an existential threat to the Anglo-Saxon way of life. Young Alfred grew up in this world of increasing but manageable danger. His father, King Ethelwulf, was a devout and capable ruler who had learned to deal with these northern pirates, much as his predecessors had dealt with other threats, through a combination of military readiness and diplomatic wisdom. When raiders came, they were fought. When they could be bought off, tribute was paid. When they could be hired as mercenaries against other enemies, deals were struck. It was the way of the world, and it seemed to work. Alfred's childhood was shaped by this delicate balance between war and peace, between the civilized world of his father's court and the growing awareness that somewhere beyond the horizon, forces were stirring that might one day challenge everything his family held dear. He learned to read and write, remarkable accomplishments for a prince of his era, but he also learned to ride and fight, to understand the loyalty owed between lord and follower, and to appreciate the complex web of alliances and obligations that held his father's kingdom together. In 853, when Alfred was just 4 years old, his father made a decision that would profoundly shape the young prince's understanding of the wider world. Ethelwulf announced that he would lead a pilgrimage to Rome, the eternal city, the heart of the Christian world. But this would be no ordinary royal journey. The king declared that he would take his youngest son with him, giving the boy an opportunity to see the world beyond Wessex, to witness the glory of the ancient empire, and perhaps to receive the blessing of the Pope himself. The journey to Rome in the 9th century was an undertaking of extraordinary difficulty and danger. The small party, for a king could not travel with a large retinue on such a venture, would have to cross the English Channel, traverse the kingdoms of Francia, where civil war raged between the grandsons of Charlemagne, navigate the treacherous mountain passes of the Alps, and finally descend into the Italian peninsula, where different dangers awaited. For young Alfred, this journey was a revelation that expanded his world beyond anything he could have imagined. He saw the great cities of Francia, some still bearing the scars of Viking raids, others displaying wealth and learning that rivaled anything in England. He crossed the Alps, those towering peaks that seemed to scrape the very heavens, and looked down upon lands where different peoples spoke different tongues, but all acknowledged the same faith, the same cultural heritage that stretched back to the Caesars. Rome itself must have been overwhelming for a child from the forests and downs of Wessex. Here were buildings that had stood for 1,000 years, churches that housed treasures beyond counting, libraries that contained the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The young prince walked streets where emperors had walked, saw monuments to conquests that had brought the known world under a single rule, and began to understand that there were forms of power and greatness beyond anything his own island kingdom had achieved. Pope Leo IV received the English king and his son with great ceremony. The Holy Father, recognizing perhaps something special in the intelligent boy who accompanied Ethelwulf, performed a ritual that would be remembered and debated by historians for centuries to come. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the Pope anointed him as king, though what exactly this meant remains a mystery. Some later writers would interpret this as a prophecy or blessing, predicting that this youngest son would one day rule. More likely, it was a ceremonial honour, perhaps making Alfred a spiritual consul or defender of the faith. But for the boy himself, standing in the presence of the successor to St. Peter, receiving the blessing of the most powerful religious figure in the Christian world, it must have been a moment of profound significance. The return journey brought different lessons. Father and son travelled through the kingdom of the Franks, where they were received at the court of Charles the Bald, grandson of the great Charlemagne. Here Alfred saw a different model of kingship, one that emphasised learning and culture as much as military prowess. Charles maintained scholars at his court, patronised the arts, and had created a renaissance of learning that was already being called the Carolingian Renaissance. The boy absorbed these lessons, storing them away for a future he could not yet imagine. But the world was changing even as they travelled. While Alfred and his father were making their stately progress through the courts of Europe, darker forces were gathering in the north. The random raids of previous decades were beginning to coalesce into something far more threatening. Viking leaders were learning to coordinate their efforts, to combine separate raiding parties into larger forces capable of taking and holding territory rather than simply striking and withdrawing. The family they returned to in 856 was already feeling the strain. Alfred's oldest brother, Ethelbald, had used his father's absence to stage what amounted to a bloodless coup, claiming the throne of Wessex for himself. The kingdom teetered on the edge of civil war as father and son faced each other with their respective supporters. Only the wisdom of the royal council and the genuine affection between Ethelwulf and his sons prevented a catastrophe that would have shattered Wessex, just as the external threat was growing more serious. A compromise was reached that split the kingdom. Ethelbald retained control of Wessex proper, while his father was given lordship over the southeastern territories of Kent, Sussex, Surrey, and Essex. It was an arrangement born of necessity rather than ideal governance, but it preserved the unity of the royal house and avoided the civil war that would have been disastrous in the face of increasing Viking pressure. Young Alfred, now 7 years old and possessed of experiences far beyond his years, watched and learned from this crisis. He saw how quickly political stability could crumble, how even the bonds of family could be strained by ambition and circumstance. But he also saw how wisdom and compromise could preserve what mattered most, the survival of the kingdom and the continuity of the dynasty. These lessons would serve him well in the trials that lay ahead. The peace within the royal family was brief but meaningful. When Ethelwulf died in 858, the succession proceeded smoothly. Ethelbald took full control of Wessex, while Ethelbert continued to rule in Kent. It seemed as though the crisis had passed and the kingdom was secure under the leadership of Alfred's capable older brothers. But Ethelbald's reign lasted only 2 years. When he died childless in 860, the crown passed to Ethelbert, who now reunited the divided territories under a single rule. The third brother was proving to be a competent king, continuing his father's policies of careful balance between defence and diplomacy. For young Alfred, now 11, and beginning to understand the responsibilities that might one day fall upon him, these were years of education in the arts of kingship. Ethelbert's reign, however, would also be brief. In 865, he too died without male heirs, and the crown passed to the fourth brother, Ethelred. Alfred, now 16, suddenly found himself just one step away from the throne of Wessex. More importantly, he found himself second in command to a kingdom that was about to face the greatest threat in its history. For in that same year, 865, the nature of the Viking threat changed forever. No longer content with seasonal raids, a massive force landed in East Anglia with a different purpose entirely. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called them the Great Heathen Army, and they had come not to raid but to conquer. Led by the legendary Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, sons of the semi-mythical Ragnar Lothbrok, they represented a new kind of Viking enterprise, organised, disciplined, and ruthlessly effective. The army was not just a military force, but a complete society on the move. Along with the warriors came craftsmen, traders, farmers, and families. They brought with them the tools, not just of conquest, but of settlement. Their intention was clear. They had come to carve out new kingdoms from English soil, to establish themselves permanently in this rich land that had attracted their raids for so many years. Within months of their arrival, the Great Heathen Army had demonstrated the inadequacy of traditional English responses to Viking attacks. They overwintered in East Anglia, something raiders had never dared to do before, and used the winter months to gather intelligence, forge alliances with local dissidents, and prepare for a campaign of conquest that would unfold over the following decade. In 866, they struck north into Northumbria, taking advantage of a civil war between two rival claimants to the Northumbrian throne. The divided kingdom fell with shocking speed. King Osbert and his rival Ella were both killed in a desperate attempt to retake York, and within months, the proud kingdom that had once been the centre of learning and culture in northern Europe was reduced to a Viking puppet state. The following year brought the conquest of East Anglia. King Edmund, who would later be venerated as a saint and martyr, fell in battle against the invaders. The kingdom that had given England some of its greatest scholars and most beautiful art was destroyed, its treasures plundered, its people enslaved or scattered. By 868, only two of the four great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms remained independent, Mercia in the Midlands and Wessex in the south. The Great Heathen Army had achieved in 3 years what centuries of previous raids had failed to accomplish: the destruction of the political order that had shaped England since the end of Roman rule. It was in this context that Alfred truly began his education in the realities of kingship. When the Vikings moved against Mercia in 868, King Burgred of that realm appealed to his allies in Wessex for help. Ethelred and Alfred led a combined army north to relieve the siege of Nottingham, where the Great Heathen Army had established itself in a fortified camp. The campaign was Alfred's first taste of serious warfare, and it provided a sobering education in the tactical superiority of the Viking forces. The combined English army was larger than the Viking force, but the raiders had chosen their position with characteristic cunning. Nottingham was a naturally defensible site, and the Vikings had improved its defences with earthworks and palisades that turned it into a fortress that could not be taken by a direct assault. For weeks, the English forces besieged the Viking position, but they lacked both the equipment and the expertise for effective siege warfare. The Vikings, meanwhile, could afford to wait. They had ample supplies, excellent defensive positions, and the knowledge that time was on their side. English armies were essentially militias, farmers and craftsmen called from their normal occupations for a specific campaign. They could not remain in the field indefinitely without creating economic chaos at home. In the end, the Vikings achieved their objective without fighting a major battle. Faced with the prospect of a siege that could drag on for months, King Burgund chose to buy them off with a substantial tribute. The Great Heathen Army agreed to leave Mercia for the time being, and the combined English forces withdrew, claiming a diplomatic victory that everyone knew was really a defeat. Alfred returned to Wessex with a new understanding of the enemy his kingdom faced. These were not the random raiders of previous decades, striking quickly and vanishing like summer storms. The Great Heathen Army was a professional military force, expertly led and equipped with the best weapons and armour that Scandinavian workshops could produce. They fought with a tactical sophistication that surpassed anything the English kingdoms could field, and they possessed the strategic patience to play a long game that their enemies were ill-equipped to match. More troubling still was the political dimension of the Viking threat. The raiders had shown themselves adept at exploiting the divisions between and within the English kingdoms. They made alliances with disaffected nobles, used local knowledge to plan their campaigns, and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of English political weaknesses. This was not merely a military invasion, but a comprehensive assault on the foundations of Anglo-Saxon civilization. Over the next few years, as the Great Heathen Army consolidated its control over the northern and eastern portions of England, Alfred devoted himself to preparing for the conflict that everyone knew was inevitable. Wessex was now the primary remaining target, the greatest prize still unconquered. The only question was when the Vikings would turn their attention south. Alfred studied everything he could about his enemies. He learned their tactics, their weapons, their methods of fortification. He observed how they moved, how they supplied themselves, how they dealt with both allies and enemies. Most importantly, he began to understand that defeating them would require not just military innovation, but a fundamental transformation of how the English kingdoms organised themselves for war. The traditional fyrd system, the militia of farmers and craftsmen who could be called up for short campaigns, was simply inadequate to face a professional army that could remain in the field year-round. The English needed to develop their own professional military capabilities, create fortified positions that could withstand siege, and above all, find ways to match the strategic mobility that gave the Vikings such a devastating advantage. But transformation takes time, and time was running out. In 870, the Great Heathen Army finally turned its attention to Wessex. After conquering East Anglia with shocking brutality, King Edmund was tortured to death, according to later accounts, shot full of arrows, like a human target. The Vikings began their advance toward the richest and most powerful of the remaining English kingdoms. Late in December 870, the Great Heathen Army crossed the Thames and struck deep into the heart of Wessex, establishing a fortified base at Reading, the final confrontation which would determine the fate of English. Civilization was about to begin. Alfred, now 21 years old and serving as his brother's chief military commander, stood at the threshold of his destiny. Everything in his life had prepared him for this moment. His education, his travels, his observation of the political and military changes reshaping his world. The youngest son, who had never been meant to rule, was about to face the greatest test in the history of his people. The year 871 would be remembered as the year of battles, a desperate struggle for survival that would see Alfred emerge from his brother's shadow to become the last hope of a free England. But first he would have to learn through bitter experience that victory against the Great Heathen Army would require more than courage and determination. It would demand a complete reimagining of what it meant to be an English king. The winter of 870 to 871 began peacefully enough in the royal hall at Chippenham. The Wessex court had gathered for the Christmas celebrations, confident that the bitter cold would keep any enemies safely in their winter quarters. King Ethelred and his brother Alfred had reason for cautious optimism as they sat beside the great fire, listening to the poems of their bards and planning for the campaigns that would come with spring. The Great Heathen Army had been contained, if not defeated. Their advance into Wessex the previous month had been met with fierce resistance. When they had attempted to establish a base at Reading, the West Saxon response had been swift and aggressive. Local forces under Ealdorman Ethelwulf had struck a Viking foraging party at Englefield on New Year's Eve, winning a significant victory that left many of the raiders dead and their companions trapped within Reading's hastily constructed defences. 4 days later, on January 4th, 871, Ethelred and Alfred had brought the main West Saxon army to Reading, determined to crush the Viking force before it could establish itself permanently in Wessex. The battle had been fierce and bloody, with the English forces fighting their way to the very gates of the Viking fortress. For a moment it had seemed as though they might break through and end the threat in a single decisive assault. But the Vikings, led by the formidable kings Bagsec and Halfdan Ragnarsson, had proven their tactical superiority once again. Just as the English attack seemed on the verge of success, the gates of Reading had burst open and a perfectly coordinated counterattack had shattered the West Saxon formation. The retreat had turned into a rout, and only their superior knowledge of the local terrain had allowed Ethelred and Alfred to escape with the remnants of their army. The defeat at Reading had been a sobering reminder of the enemy's capabilities, but it had not broken West Saxon resolve. 4 days later, at a place called Ashdown on the Berkshire Downs, the English had gained their revenge. In a hard-fought battle that raged around a solitary thorn tree, Alfred had shown his growing military prowess by leading a desperate uphill charge against the Viking earls, while his brother engaged their kings. The victory at Ashdown had been complete and devastating. King Bagsec was among the dead, along with 5 Viking earls whose names, Sidroc the Old, Sidroc the Younger, Osbern, Frana, and Harold, would be remembered as a testament to English valour. The survivors had fled in panic, pursued by the triumphant West Saxons until darkness ended the slaughter. For one glorious day, it had seemed as though the tide had turned, that the Great Heathen Army might have been broken at last. But Viking resilience proved as formidable as Viking ferocity. Within 2 weeks, they had regrouped and struck back at Bussing, where superior numbers and tactical discipline gave them another crushing victory over the West Saxons. The pattern continued through the spring. At Meerutun, fought in the shadow of the approaching Easter season, the English had seemed on the verge of victory once again, only to see triumph turn to defeat when a Danish reserve force had emerged from concealment to turn the tide of battle. Bishop Haymond of Sherborne, one of the most respected religious leaders in Wessex, had fallen in that bitter defeat. His death a symbol of how the Viking invasion threatened not just political independence, but the very soul of English Christian civilization. 9 battles had been fought in the space of 12 months, with the West Saxons winning only one clear victory. The casualties had been enormous on both sides, but Wessex simply could not afford to trade losses with an enemy that seemed to have inexhaustible reserves. Worse still, the constant warfare was beginning to tear apart the social and economic fabric that held the kingdom together. It was in this context that King Ethelred fell ill shortly after Easter. Whether his sickness was the result of wounds received in battle, the accumulated stress of the campaign, or simply the will of God, none could say. But as the spring of 871 turned towards summer, it became clear that the king was dying. On an April morning, with the apple blossoms white on the trees and the promise of new life stirring in every field and forest, Ethelred breathed his last. Alfred, just 22 years old, found himself King of Wessex at the darkest hour in his people's history. The circumstances of his accession were unprecedented. Ethelred had left behind 2 young sons, Ethelhelm and Ethelwald, who under normal circumstances might have expected to inherit their father's crown. But these were not normal circumstances. The Viking threat demanded immediate, experienced leadership, and the royal council had no hesitation in choosing the brother who had already proven himself in battle over nephews who were still children. Alfred's first action as king was characteristic of both his pragmatism and his faith. While his brother's body was prepared for burial at Wimborne Minster, Alfred opened negotiations with the Great Heathen Army. The terms of the peace he negotiated have not been recorded, but it certainly involved a substantial payment of silver, the first of many such payments that would drain Wessex's treasury over the coming years. The peace bought time, but at a terrible cost. The Great Heathen Army used the respite to consolidate its hold over the territories it had conquered, establishing permanent settlements and administrative structures that made their presence increasingly difficult to reverse. Viking colonies were established throughout East Anglia and Northumbria, bringing Scandinavian farmers and craftsmen to work the land alongside the warriors who had conquered it. More troubling still was the example this success provided to other Viking groups. The demonstration that England could be conquered rather than merely raided attracted new waves of adventurers from Denmark, Norway, and the growing Viking settlements in Ireland and the Scottish Isles. What had begun as a single invasion was becoming a general migration that threatened to overwhelm the remaining English kingdoms through sheer weight of numbers. Alfred used the breathing space to begin the reforms that would eventually save his kingdom, but progress was slow and the challenges seemed overwhelming. The fyrd system needed to be restructured to provide a more professional military capability, but such changes could not be implemented overnight. Fortifications needed to be built or improved at strategic locations throughout Wessex, but this required resources and expertise that were in short supply. Most challenging of all was the need to maintain morale among a people who had suffered repeated defeats and seen their neighbours conquered or scattered. The old certainties that had sustained English society for generations were crumbling. The protection that kings had traditionally provided their subjects was proving inadequate against this new threat, and some began to question whether resistance was worth the terrible cost it demanded. For 7 years, from 871 to 878, Alfred walked this tightrope between hope and despair, using every diplomatic and military skill he possessed to keep Wessex independent while building the capabilities that might eventually allow him to drive the invaders from English soil. It was a period of constant tension, of limited resources stretched to their breaking point, of communities that lived in daily fear of attack. The Great Heathen Army, meanwhile, continued its methodical conquest of England. In 874, they finally overwhelmed Mercia, driving King Burgred into exile and replacing him with a puppet ruler named Ceolwulf, who governed at Viking sufferance. The last independent English kingdom besides Wessex had fallen, leaving Alfred increasingly isolated. Even more ominously, the Viking force began to split up as various groups established permanent settlements in their conquered territories. This might have seemed like good news, the dispersal of enemy strength, but Alfred recognized the true significance of the development. The Vikings were no longer merely raiders or even conquerors. They were becoming the new ruling class of the greater part of England, establishing themselves as kings and earls over English subjects who had little choice but to submit. By 876, Alfred's position had become increasingly precarious. A portion of the Great Heathen Army, now led by a king named Guthrum, began probing the defences of Wessex itself. They established a base at Wareham in Dorset, threatening the kingdom from a new direction and forcing Alfred to divide his already stretched forces. The siege of Wareham demonstrated both Alfred's growing tactical sophistication and the limitations of his resources. He succeeded in blockading the Viking position, preventing them from breaking out to raid the surrounding countryside. But when Guthrum's forces slipped away by sea to establish a new base at Exeter, Alfred could only follow and repeat the process. like a man trying to plug holes in a dam with insufficient material. At Exeter, Alfred achieved what seemed like a diplomatic triumph. Faced with a determined siege and cut off from supplies by a storm that destroyed much of their fleet, Guthrum's warriors agreed to leave Wessex entirely. They swore solemn oaths on a holy ring associated with their god Thor, provided hostages as surety for their promise, and in the autumn of 877 withdrew to take up winter quarters in Gloucester, safely outside Wessex territory. Alfred allowed himself to believe that he had won a crucial victory. The immediate threat to his kingdom seemed to have passed, and, for the first time in years, he could contemplate a peaceful Christmas celebration. He chose to hold his court at Chippenham, a royal estate in the heart of Wiltshire that had particular significance for the West Saxon monarchy. Chippenham lay in beautiful country, its halls and outbuildings spread across fertile land that epitomised the prosperity Alfred was fighting to preserve. Here, surrounded by his closest advisers and most trusted warriors, the king could rest from the constant vigilance that had marked his reign thus far. The great hall was decorated with garlands of holly and ivy. The tables groaned under the weight of Christmas feasts, and for a few precious weeks it seemed as though the nightmare of the past decade might be ending. But Guthrum had not given up his ambitions for Wessex. The oath-breaking that followed would be remembered as one of the most treacherous acts in an age that was no stranger to betrayal. On the night of January 6th, 878, 12th night, when the Christmas celebrations were at their height and the court was relaxed in holiday cheer, the Vikings struck. The attack came without warning, launched under cover of darkness, when the West Saxon guards were least alert and the king's household was scattered in revelry. Guthrum had marched his entire army through the winter landscape, moving with a speed and stealth that caught Alfred's forces completely unprepared. By dawn, Viking warriors were pouring through the streets of Chippenham, killing anyone who resisted and taking control of the royal estate. Alfred's survival in those first desperate hours was due entirely to the devotion of his personal retainers. While his household troops fought a desperate rearguard action to buy time, a small group of mounted warriors surrounded their king and fought their way clear of the town. Behind them, Chippenham burned as the Vikings celebrated their greatest triumph yet, the capture of the very heart of West Saxon royal power. The shock of the attack reverberated throughout Wessex with devastating effect. The news that their king had been surprised and nearly captured, that the royal court had been scattered and the chief royal residence taken, broke the spirit of resistance that Alfred had carefully nurtured through 7 years of struggle. Local officials who had remained loyal through every previous crisis now calculated that the kingdom was finished and began making their peace with the inevitable. Some fled overseas following the example of the Mercian nobility who had sought refuge in Frankish courts when their own kingdom fell. Others retreated to fortified positions and declared their neutrality, hoping to preserve their lands and lives by avoiding any involvement in what seemed like a hopeless cause. Most devastating of all, many simply submitted to Guthrum, accepting Viking rule as the price of protecting their families and communities. Within weeks of the Chippenham attack, the carefully constructed defences of Wessex had collapsed like a house of cards. Viking forces spread throughout the kingdom, meeting little organised resistance as they occupied royal estates, seized strategic positions, and began the process of establishing permanent control over their new conquest. Alfred, meanwhile, found himself in a position that would have been unthinkable just months before. The King of Wessex, descendant of Cerdic and heir to 3 centuries of West Saxon glory, was reduced to the status of a fugitive, moving through the winter landscape with a handful of loyal followers and no fixed base of operations. His situation seemed hopeless by any rational calculation. His kingdom had been conquered, his army scattered, his treasury captured. The great lords who had been the backbone of his military system were dead, in exile or in submission to the enemy. The administrative apparatus that had governed Wessex for generations had ceased to function. By every precedent in the Viking conquest of England, his reign was over and his kingdom extinct. But Alfred possessed something that his enemies had not counted on: an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Where other kings might have fled overseas or sought terms with the conquerors, Alfred chose to continue the struggle from whatever base he could find. If he could not fight as a king with armies at his command, he would fight as a guerrilla leader with whatever forces remained loyal to the cause of English independence. The Somerset levels, where Alfred would make his desperate stand, were unlike anywhere else in England. Here, between the Mendip and Quantock hills, lay a vast area of marshland intersected by rivers and streams that created a landscape of islands and waterways. In winter, much of the region was completely flooded, accessible only to those who knew the hidden paths and secret channels that connected one piece of high ground to another. It was to one of these islands, a place called Athelney, the Isle of Princes, that Alfred and his small band of followers made their way in the dark days of January 878. Here, surrounded by miles of treacherous marshland that would prevent any large-scale attack, the last free king in England would establish his final stronghold. The fortress Alfred built at Athelney was unlike the great stone castles that would later dominate the English landscape. Constructed of timber and earth, it was more a fortified village than a true military installation. But it served its purpose perfectly, providing a secure base from which Alfred could begin the slow process of rebuilding his shattered kingdom. The legend of the burned cakes, first recorded more than a century after Alfred's death, captures something essential about these desperate months. The story tells of how the king, travelling in disguise, was given shelter by a peasant woman who did not recognise him. When she left him to watch some cakes baking by the fire, Alfred became so absorbed in his thoughts about the kingdom's problems that he let them burn, earning a sharp rebuke from his hostess. Whether or not the incident actually occurred, the tale reflects the transformation that Alfred underwent during his time in the marshes. The king who had ruled from golden halls was learning to live as his humblest subjects lived, sharing their dangers and hardships, understanding their needs and fears in a way that no previous English monarch had ever done. From Athelney, Alfred began the patient work of resistance. Using the marshland as his base, he sent out small parties to strike at Viking patrols and supply columns. These attacks were carefully planned to avoid unnecessary casualties while maximising the psychological impact on the occupying forces. The message was clear. The King of Wessex still lived, still fought, and still commanded the loyalty of his people. More importantly, Alfred used his months in exile to maintain contact with the scattered remnants of his administration. Secret messengers moved through the kingdom, carrying instructions to local officials who had remained loyal and coordinating acts of passive resistance that made Viking rule increasingly difficult. Where possible, he established hidden supply depots and safe houses that could support future military operations. The work was slow and dangerous, requiring a level of personal courage that went far beyond anything expected of a traditional king. Alfred himself led many of the reconnaissance missions that gathered intelligence about Viking movements and intentions. He learned to move unseen through his own kingdom, to read the subtle signs that indicated local sentiment, and to judge which communities might be prepared to rise when the time came for a general rebellion. Perhaps most crucially, Alfred used his time in the marshes to refine his understanding of why the Vikings had been so successful and what would be required to defeat them. He observed their methods of fortification, their supply systems, their command structures. He studied the mistakes that had led to English defeats and began developing new tactical approaches that might prove more effective against Viking warfare. The psychological dimension of the struggle was as important as the military one. Alfred's survival in itself was a powerful symbol that the cause of English independence was not lost. As word spread that the king still lived and still fought, it began to stiffen resistance throughout Wessex. Local officials who had been wavering in their loyalties found the courage to resist Viking demands. Communities that had been resigned to foreign rule began to hope for liberation, but hope alone would not be enough to drive the invaders from English soil. As the spring of 878 approached, Alfred knew that his period of exile was drawing to a close. If he was to reclaim his kingdom, it would have to be through decisive military action that could shatter Viking control and restore West Saxon independence in a single dramatic campaign. The intelligence network that Alfred had carefully constructed during his months in hiding brought encouraging news as winter turned to spring. The Viking occupation, while militarily successful, was proving politically unstable. Guthrum's forces were spread thin across the vast territory they had conquered, with small garrisons holding key positions while the main army moved between different bases as circumstances required. More importantly, the promise of easy conquest that had attracted many warriors to Guthrum's banner was proving illusory. The Vikings found themselves committed to the tedious work of governing a hostile population, collecting taxes, and maintaining order, tasks that were far less appealing than the glory and plunder of active campaigning. Desertion rates were rising as warriors slipped away to seek easier opportunities elsewhere. Alfred also learned that help was coming from an unexpected quarter. In Devon, the local ealdorman Odda had maintained his independence and was preparing to resist a separate Viking force under Ubba, one of the original leaders of the Great Heathen Army. If Odda could achieve a victory in the west, it would not only eliminate a significant portion of the Viking forces, but also provide a powerful example that the invaders could be defeated. The news Alfred had been waiting for came in late winter. Ubba's force, some 23 ships strong, had landed on the Devon coast and was attempting to establish a base at Countisbury, a hilltop fortress that commanded the approaches to the rich lands of central Devon. Odda and his men had taken refuge within the ancient earthworks, but they were vastly outnumbered and running short of supplies. The battle that followed would become one of the most celebrated victories in the entire struggle against the Vikings. Rather than wait passively for starvation to force their surrender, Odda and his warriors chose to burst out of their fortress at dawn, catching Ubba's forces completely by surprise. The Viking leader and more than 800 of his men were killed in the savage fighting that followed, while the survivors fled in panic to their ships. Among the trophies captured at Countisbury was the famous Raven Banner, a sacred standard that the Vikings believed had been woven by the daughters of Ragnar Lothbrok himself and possessed magical powers that ensured victory for whoever carried it. The loss of this symbol, along with the death of one of their most respected leaders, sent shockwaves through the entire Viking community in England. For Alfred, the victory in Devon was the signal he had been waiting for. If the supposedly invincible Vikings could be defeated by a local force fighting on its own, what might be accomplished by a properly coordinated campaign that brought together all the remaining resources of Wessex? The king sent out a carefully coded message to his surviving supporters throughout the kingdom. After Easter, they were to gather at Egbert's Stone, a traditional meeting place on the border between Somerset and Wiltshire. The call went out not just to the professional warriors who formed the core of the royal army, but to every free man in Wessex who was willing to risk everything for the chance to drive the invaders from their homeland. The response exceeded Alfred's most optimistic expectations. As the appointed day approached, men began converging on the ancient meeting place from every corner of the kingdom. They came not as organised military units, but as individuals and small groups, farmers and craftsmen, alongside the professional soldiers, all united by a common determination to reclaim their freedom. The gathering at Egbert's Stone was one of the most remarkable moments in English history. Here, assembled around the ancient marker stone, that commemorated Alfred's grandfather's victories was the kernel of what would become the army that saved England. These were not the well-equipped levies of earlier campaigns, but desperate men who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Alfred's appearance at the assembly point sent a shock of recognition through the crowd. Many had not seen their king for months and had begun to wonder if the reports of his survival were merely wishful thinking. But here he stood before them, thinner than before and marked by the hardships of his exile, but unmistakably alive and radiating the quiet confidence that had always been his greatest strength. The speech Alfred gave that day has not been recorded, but its effect was transformative. Within hours, what had been a collection of desperate individuals had become an army united by shared purpose and absolute faith in their leader. The king, who had learned to live among his people during his time of exile, had earned a loyalty that no amount of royal pageantry could have achieved. The army that marched from Egbert's Stone was unlike any that had taken the field during the previous decade of warfare. These men were not fighting for abstract concepts of political independence or royal authority. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. They knew exactly what defeat would mean, and they were prepared to die rather than accept it. Alfred's strategy for the coming campaign reflected both his tactical evolution and his understanding of the psychological moment. Rather than attempting to recapture Chippenham directly, he planned to draw Guthrum's main force out of its fortified positions and defeat it in open battle. Only a clear, decisive victory that demonstrated beyond question the superior fighting power of the English would be sufficient to break the spell of Viking invincibility. The march route Alfred chose was designed to ensure that news of his approach would reach Guthrum quickly, while giving the English army the maximum possible advantage when battle was finally joined. Moving from Egbert's Stone to Iley Oak, and then to the open downs near Eddington, the West Saxon forces would fight on ground of their choosing against an enemy that would be forced to respond hastily to an unexpected threat. But first, Alfred needed to complete the psychological transformation of his forces. These were men who had lived with defeat and occupation for months, who had seen their kingdom conquered and their leaders scattered. To face the Great Heathen Army in open battle, they would need absolute confidence in their cause, their leader, and their ability to achieve victory against odds that still seemed overwhelming. The night before the battle, as his army camped within sight of the Viking positions, Alfred moved among his men with a quiet word for each group. He spoke of the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment, of the homes and families they were fighting to protect, of the certainty that God would grant victory to those who fought in a just cause. More practically, he explained the tactical plan that would give them their best chance of success. Unlike previous battles where English forces had relied primarily on individual courage and the shock of a headlong charge, this campaign would be won through disciplined teamwork and careful coordination. Every man would need to trust his neighbours, follow orders precisely, and maintain formation even in the heat of combat. The transformation was visible in the bearing of the troops as they prepared for battle. These were no longer the demoralised remnants of a defeated kingdom, but the soldiers of a reborn nation fighting for everything they held dear. The months of exile and resistance had burned away everything except the essential core of English identity, and what remained was harder and stronger than anything that had come before. As dawn broke on May 12th, 878, the two armies faced each other across the rolling downs near Eddington. On one side stood Guthrum and the Great Heathen Army, the conquerors of 3 kingdoms, veterans of 100 battles, confident in their superior numbers and tactical expertise. On the other stood Alfred and the last free army of the English, carrying with them the hopes and prayers of a people who had endured 7 years of invasion and occupation. The battle that was about to unfold would determine not just the fate of Wessex, but the entire future course of English history. If Alfred's forces were defeated, the conquest of England would be complete, and the Viking Age would enter a new phase of permanent settlement and assimilation. If they achieved victory, it would mark the beginning of the long struggle to reclaim the conquered territories and rebuild English political unity. The morning mist hung low over the Wiltshire Downs as the two armies deployed for battle. For Alfred, everything had led to this moment: 7 years of warfare, months of exile, and a lifetime of preparation for the role he had never expected to inherit. As he rode along the ranks of his army, speaking words of encouragement to groups of nervous farmers and craftsmen who had never faced professional warriors in open combat, the King of Wessex carried with him the hopes of every free Englishman. Guthrum's army was formidable in its discipline and experience. These were warriors who had conquered kingdoms, veterans of countless battles fought from Ireland to the Baltic Sea. They formed their ranks with the casual efficiency of men who had performed this ritual hundreds of times before, their shields locked together in the famous shield wall that had broken so many English charges over the past decade. But Alfred's forces possessed something that their enemies had not anticipated: the desperate courage of men fighting for their homes and families. As the English army advanced up the gentle slope toward the Viking position, they moved with a unity of purpose that surprised even their own king. These were not merely subjects obeying their lord's commands, but free men who had chosen their fate and were prepared to accept its consequences. The battle began with the traditional exchange of missile weapons, spears, arrows, and stones hurled by both sides as they closed to fighting distance. But the real test came when the two shield walls collided in a grinding contest of strength, skill, and endurance that would determine the future of England. For hours the battle raged, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Vikings fought with their usual professional competence, their front rank maintaining perfect discipline, while reserves waited to exploit any breakthrough. But gradually, the passion and determination of Alfred's forces began to tell. Where the English line bent under pressure, it did not break. Where individual warriors fell, others stepped forward to fill the gaps. Alfred himself fought in the front rank, as was the custom for kings of his era, his presence inspiring his men to feats of heroism that surprised even themselves. Around him, the core of professional warriors, who had remained loyal through the darkest months, provided the tactical expertise that turned raw courage into effective military action. The breakthrough, when it came, was sudden and complete. A charge led by Alfred himself broke through the Viking centre, isolating the flanks and throwing the entire enemy formation into confusion. What had been a disciplined army became a mob of individuals concerned only with personal survival. The pursuit that followed was merciless, continuing until darkness ended the slaughter and the survivors reached the safety of their fortified base at Chippenham. But Alfred's greatest victory was still to come. Rather than allowing his triumphant army to disperse and celebrate, he immediately laid siege to Chippenham, trapping Guthrum and the remnants of his forces within the very fortress they had captured with such confidence 5 months earlier. The psychological impact of this reversal was devastating to Viking morale and electrifying to English spirits throughout the kingdom. The siege that followed demonstrated Alfred's maturation as both a military commander and a political leader. Unlike the inconclusive blockades of earlier campaigns, this operation was methodically planned and ruthlessly executed. Supply lines were cut, escape routes blocked, and psychological pressure applied through a combination of military demonstrations and carefully crafted propaganda. Within 2 weeks, the situation inside Chippenham had become hopeless. Guthrum's forces, accustomed to living off the countryside they controlled, found themselves trapped without adequate provisions and facing the prospect of slow starvation. More importantly, the news of their defeat and subsequent siege was spreading throughout the Viking communities in England, encouraging resistance among the English population and undermining the political foundations of the conquest. The terms Alfred offered for Guthrum's surrender were remarkably generous, reflecting both the king's strategic wisdom and his understanding of the broader political situation. Rather than demanding the complete elimination of the Viking presence in England, an impossibility given the extent of Scandinavian settlement that had already taken place, Alfred proposed a division of the country that would allow both peoples to coexist while ensuring the survival of English political independence. The negotiations that followed were as crucial as the battle itself, establishing precedents that would shape English politics for generations to come. Guthrum was required to accept baptism as a Christian, symbolically submitting to the cultural and religious authority of the English king. He was also required to withdraw from Wessex entirely, acknowledging Alfred's sovereignty over the southern and western portions of England. In return, Alfred recognised Guthrum's authority over the territories his forces had already conquered, essentially the eastern and northern portions of England that would become known as the Danelaw. This arrangement provided a practical solution to an impossible situation, allowing the Vikings to keep what they had taken while ensuring that the heartland of English civilization remained under English control. The baptism ceremony, held at Alla near Athelney 3 weeks after the siege ended, was one of the most remarkable events of the entire Viking Age. Here, the king who had led the Great Heathen Army in its conquest of 3 English kingdoms knelt before Alfred and accepted not only Christian baptism, but also the spiritual authority of the man who had just defeated him in battle. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate. By standing as godfather to his former enemy, Alfred was not merely accepting a political surrender, but creating a spiritual bond that transcended the immediate military situation. Guthrum, who took the baptismal name Ethelstan in honour of Alfred's deceased brother, was now bound to the English king by ties of blood brotherhood that even the violent politics of the age treated as sacred. The celebration that followed at Wedmore, where the treaty was formally ratified, marked the beginning of a new era in English history. For the first time in 7 years, the threat of immediate conquest had been lifted from Wessex. The king, who had been reduced to the status of a fugitive just months before, was now recognised as the paramount ruler in England, acknowledged even by his enemies as a force that could not be ignored. But Alfred understood that military victory was only the beginning of the task before him. The kingdom he had reclaimed was devastated by years of warfare, its population demoralised, its institutions weakened, and its defences proven inadequate against the kind of professional military threat that the Viking Age had introduced to European politics. The reforms Alfred implemented over the following 2 decades would transform not only Wessex, but the entire concept of English kingship. Drawing on lessons learned during his years of struggle against the Great Heathen Army, he created new institutions and systems that would prove capable of defending English independence, while also laying the foundations for the eventual reunification of the country. The most visible of these reforms was the creation of the Burgle system, a network of fortified towns that could serve as both defensive strongpoints and administrative centres. Unlike the old Roman cities that had been allowed to decay during the centuries of Anglo-Saxon rule, these new burhs were designed specifically to meet the challenges of the Viking Age. Each burh was strategically located to control important roads, river crossings, or coastal approaches that might be used by invading forces. They were spaced approximately 20 miles apart, ensuring that no point in the kingdom was more than a day's march from a fortified refuge. Most importantly, they were designed not just as military installations, but as thriving commercial centres that could support themselves economically while providing secure bases for military operations. The system required a complete restructuring of the kingdom's administrative and military obligations. Each burh was assigned a specific area of surrounding countryside that was responsible for providing the manpower and resources needed to maintain its defences. The traditional fyrd system was reformed to ensure that trained warriors would always be available to garrison these strong points, while also providing field armies that could respond to external threats. Alfred's military reforms went far beyond the creation of static defences. Understanding that the Vikings' greatest advantage lay in their mobility and their ability to choose when and where to fight, he created England's first permanent navy, a fleet of specially designed warships that could intercept raiders before they reached the coast and prevent enemy forces from using England's rivers as highways for invasion. The new ships were larger and more heavily armed than anything the Vikings possessed, designed not for the hit-and-run tactics that had characterized earlier naval warfare, but for the kind of sustained combat that could destroy enemy fleets and establish English control over the surrounding waters. While the technical details of their construction have been lost, contemporary accounts describe them as revolutionary in their design and devastatingly effective in action. Perhaps most importantly, Alfred recognized that military strength alone would not be sufficient to preserve English independence in the long term. The cultural and intellectual foundations of English society needed to be strengthened to ensure that future generations would possess both the knowledge and the will to maintain what he had restored. The educational reforms Alfred initiated were unprecedented in early medieval Europe. Convinced that the Viking invasions were divine punishment for the decline of learning and piety in England, he launched an ambitious programme to restore literacy and scholarship to levels that had not been seen since the golden age of Northumbrian culture 2 centuries earlier. Alfred himself led by example, learning Latin in his 30s and personally translating key works of Christian philosophy and practical governance into English. His translations of Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and other classical texts were not merely scholarly exercises, but practical efforts to provide English administrators and clergy with the intellectual tools they needed to govern effectively. The king's commitment to education extended to the establishment of a court school that was open not only to the children of nobles, but also to promising young men of humble birth who showed intellectual ability. This was a revolutionary concept for the time, reflecting Alfred's understanding that effective governance required a literate administrative class drawn from all levels of society. The cultural impact of these educational reforms was profound and lasting. By insisting that important works be available in English rather than Latin, Alfred helped establish the vernacular as a legitimate language for serious intellectual discourse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which began systematic compilation during his reign, provided not only a record of contemporary events, but also a sense of shared English identity that transcended regional differences. The legal reforms Alfred implemented were equally innovative, combining traditional English customs with Christian principles and practical lessons learned from his struggles against the Vikings. His law code, known as the Doom Book, was the most comprehensive legal compilation that had been attempted in England since the Roman period. Unlike earlier law codes that had focused primarily on setting prices for different types of crimes, Alfred's laws addressed the fundamental principles of justice and governance. They emphasized the importance of oaths and pledges as the foundation of social order, established procedures for fair trials, and created mechanisms for resolving disputes without resort to violence. The code also reflected Alfred's understanding of the political realities of his time. Recognizing that the traditional bonds of lordship and kinship had been weakened by years of warfare and displacement, the laws placed new emphasis on territorial and governmental authorities. Local officials were given greater powers and responsibilities, while the king's role as the ultimate source of justice was clearly established. These reforms were not implemented without resistance. Many nobles who had grown accustomed to the informal personal style of governance that had characterized earlier Anglo-Saxon kingship found Alfred's systematic approach threatening to their traditional privileges. The constant demands for military service, taxation, and labour on fortification projects created burdens that some communities found difficult to bear. But Alfred's personal authority, enhanced by his victory over the Vikings and his reputation for fairness and wisdom, was sufficient to overcome most opposition. More importantly, the practical benefits of his reforms became evident as the kingdom grew stronger and more prosperous with each passing year. The test of these reforms came in 892, when a new Viking army landed in England with the intention of completing the conquest that Guthrum had failed to achieve. This force, fresh from campaigns in Francia and led by experienced commanders, represented a threat that might have been insurmountable for the old Wessex of Alfred's youth. But the kingdom they invaded was no longer the same country that had nearly fallen to the Great Heathen Army 14 years earlier. The network of burhs channeled the invaders into predetermined killing zones where English forces could engage them on advantageous terms. The reformed fyrd provided trained soldiers who could match Viking professionals in both equipment and tactical sophistication. Most importantly, the population as a whole had been transformed from passive victims into active participants in their own defence. The campaigns that followed demonstrated the effectiveness of Alfred's strategic vision. Rather than the desperate improvisations that had characterised earlier responses to Viking invasion, the English defence was methodical and coordinated. Viking forces found themselves constantly harassed by local garrisons, unable to establish secure bases, and gradually worn down by the cumulative effect of hundreds of small engagements. The climax of the campaign came when Alfred personally led the operation that trapped a major Viking force in their fortified position along the River Lea. Rather than attempting a costly direct assault, the king ordered the construction of obstacles that prevented the enemy ships from escaping downstream. Faced with the choice between starvation and abandonment of their vessels, the Vikings chose to flee overland, leaving behind the fleet that had been essential to their strategic mobility. The psychological impact of this victory was even greater than its military significance. The Vikings, who had terrorised Europe for nearly a century, had been outmanoeuvred and outfought by an English king using methods that combined traditional courage with innovative tactics. The aura of invincibility that had been their greatest weapon was finally broken. By 896, the surviving members of the Viking army had given up their attempts to conquer Wessex and dispersed to seek easier opportunities elsewhere. Some sailed back to the continent, others settled in the already established Danelaw, and a few even entered Alfred's service as mercenaries. The immediate threat to English independence had ended, not through negotiation or payment of tribute, but through the complete military defeat of the invading forces. The kingdom Alfred left to his son Edward when he died in 899 was fundamentally different from the one he had inherited 28 years earlier. Where there had been a collection of competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, there was now a unified English state with the military, administrative, and cultural resources needed to undertake the reconquest of the territories lost to Viking conquest. The transformation was not merely political, but also psychological. Alfred had created not just a stronger kingdom, but a new sense of English identity that transcended the tribal loyalties and regional divisions that had weakened resistance to the Viking invasions. His subjects thought of themselves not merely as West Saxons or Mercians, but as English people united in defence of their common heritage. The foundations Alfred laid would prove their worth in the decades that followed his death. Under his son, Edward the Elder, and his grandson Athelstan, the English would systematically reconquer the Danelaw, drive the Vikings from their last strongholds in northern England, and establish a unified kingdom that extended from the English Channel to the Scottish border. But Alfred's greatest achievement was not military or political, but cultural. He had preserved the essential elements of English Christian civilization during its darkest hour and transmitted them to future generations in forms that could survive and flourish in the new world that was emerging from the chaos of the Viking Age. The king who had learned to burn cakes in a peasant's cottage had become something unprecedented in early medieval Europe, a monarch whose authority rested not merely on birth or conquest, but on his proven ability to protect his people and promote their welfare. In creating this new model of kingship, Alfred had established precedents that would shape English political development for centuries to come. More immediately, he had saved England itself. Without Alfred's resistance during the dark winter of 878, without his reforms during the peaceful years that followed, without his final victory over the Viking challenge in the 890s, the unique blend of Germanic, Celtic, and Roman influences that would eventually produce English culture might never have survived. The final years of Alfred's reign were marked by a profound sense of accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that his work was not yet complete. The king who had once hidden in the Somerset marshes now ruled over a kingdom that was widely recognised as the most powerful and best governed realm in Britain. Yet Alfred understood that true security could only come with the reunification of all the English territories under a single crown, a task that would fall to his successors. By the mid-890s, Alfred's health was beginning to decline. The mysterious illness that had plagued him since his wedding night, possibly Crohn's disease or a similar chronic condition, grew progressively worse despite the attentions of the best physicians available in 9th century Europe. The constant stress of nearly 3 decades of kingship, the physical demands of numerous military campaigns, and the psychological burden of carrying responsibility for his people's survival had taken their inevitable toll. Yet even as his body weakened, Alfred's mind remained as sharp and active as ever. He continued to personally oversee the translation projects that were bringing classical learning within reach of English readers. He refined the administrative systems that governed his kingdom, always seeking ways to make them more efficient and responsive to popular needs. Most importantly, he devoted increasing attention to the education of his son Edward, ensuring that the next generation would be prepared to continue the work of English reunification. Edward, now in his 20s and already proven in battle, represented everything Alfred had hoped to achieve through his reforms. Unlike his father, who had been thrust into kingship during a crisis, Edward had been systematically prepared for rule from childhood. He possessed not only the traditional warrior skills expected of an Anglo-Saxon king, but also the literacy, legal knowledge, and administrative expertise that Alfred had recognised as essential for effective governance in the post-Viking world. The relationship between father and son during these final years was one of mutual respect and shared purpose. Alfred had learned from his own experience that the transition between reigns was always a moment of vulnerability, particularly in kingdoms that faced external threats. By gradually transferring responsibilities to Edward, while remaining available for consultation and guidance, he ensured that the succession would be as smooth as possible. The cultural achievements of Alfred's final years were perhaps his most lasting contribution to English civilization. The court he had established at Winchester had become a centre of learning and artistic achievement that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. Scholars from across the continent sought positions in his service, attracted by both his generous patronage and his personal commitment to intellectual excellence. The manuscripts produced in Alfred's scriptoriums were masterpieces of both art and scholarship. The famous Alfred jewel, discovered centuries later in Somerset, bears an inscription identifying it as something Alfred ordered me to be made, and may have been one of the reading pointers that accompanied copies of his translated works sent to churches throughout the kingdom. Such attention to both the content and presentation of learning reflected Alfred's understanding that cultural authority was as important as military power in establishing lasting political dominance. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which reached its mature form during these years, provided not only a record of contemporary events, but also a sense of historical continuity that linked Alfred's achievements to the broader sweep of English development. By ensuring that his reign was properly documented and that his reforms were explained for future generations, Alfred was consciously shaping how posterity would remember both his accomplishments and the principles that had guided them. Religious foundations also occupied much of Alfred's attention during his final years. The monasteries he established at Athelney and Shaftesbury were intended not merely as centres of prayer and contemplation, but as institutions that could preserve and transmit the learning and cultural values he had worked so hard to restore. The fact that he chose his daughter, Ethelgifu, as the first abbess of Shaftesbury reflected his conviction that women, as well as men, had essential roles to play in the cultural renaissance he was promoting. Perhaps most importantly, Alfred used these peaceful years to codify the military and administrative innovations that had enabled Wessex to survive the Viking challenge. The Burgel-Heidage, a document that specified the obligations of each community toward the maintenance of the fortress system, ensured that his defensive innovations would survive his death. Similarly, the legal and administrative procedures he had developed were recorded in forms that could be transmitted to future generations of royal officials. The foreign relations Alfred established during his final years laid important groundwork for his successor's expansion beyond the borders of Wessex. Through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and strategic marriages, he had begun the process of extending West Saxon influence over the neighbouring kingdoms that had survived the Viking invasions. His daughter Ethelfled's marriage to Ethelred, the ealdorman who governed what remained of independent Mercia, was particularly significant. This alliance not only secured Alfred's northern border, but also positioned his family to inherit control over Mercia when Ethelred died. The precedent established by this arrangement would prove crucial when Edward began his systematic conquest of the Danelaw. Similarly, Alfred's careful cultivation of relationships with the Welsh kingdoms provided both security for his western borders and potential allies for future campaigns against the Viking territories. The Welsh princes who attended his court and acknowledged his overlordship brought with them not only political submission, but also the military resources that would be essential for the reconquest campaigns that lay ahead. The naval innovations Alfred had pioneered were refined and expanded during his final years, creating a maritime capability that would prove essential for controlling the rivers and coastal waters through which Viking reinforcements might attempt to reach England. The ship designs developed in his yards influenced naval construction throughout northern Europe and established principles of warship design that would remain relevant for centuries. Yet for all his achievements in war and statecraft, Alfred never lost sight of the personal dimensions of kingship that had been revealed to him during his months of exile in the Somerset marshes. The king who had learned to live among common people retained a connection to their concerns and aspirations that set him apart from the remote, ceremonial monarchy that characterized most early medieval rulers. This accessibility was reflected in the legal reforms of his final years, which emphasized not only the abstract principles of justice, but also the practical needs of ordinary people seeking fair resolution of their disputes. Alfred's law code was notable for its attention to the rights of the poor and powerless, establishing precedents that would influence English legal development for generations to come. The economic prosperity that Wessex enjoyed during Alfred's final years was both a result of his reforms and a foundation for future expansion. The security provided by the Burgel system encouraged trade and manufacturing, while the administrative efficiency of his government ensured that resources could be mobilized effectively when needed. The kingdom Edward inherited was not only militarily stronger than the one Alfred had received, but also considerably wealthier and more populous. As the new century approached, Alfred could look back on nearly 3 decades of rule that had transformed not only his own kingdom, but the entire political landscape of Britain. The England of 900 was a very different place from the England of 871. Where there had been 4 competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms constantly threatened by Viking invasion, there was now a single English state with the confidence and capability to contemplate the reunification of all the territories that had been lost to foreign conquest. The final months of Alfred's life were spent in careful preparation for the transition to his son's rule. Documents were prepared transferring estates and responsibilities, key officials were briefed on ongoing projects and policies, and arrangements were made to ensure that the administrative machinery of government would continue to function smoothly during the inevitable period of adjustment that would follow any change of ruler. On October 26, 899, Alfred died peacefully at Winchester, surrounded by his family and closest advisors. His death marked the end of an era in English history, but it also represented the successful completion of the most important task any ruler could accomplish: the preservation and strengthening of his kingdom for transmission to the next generation. The immediate response to Alfred's death demonstrated how completely he had succeeded in creating the stable, unified realm he had envisioned. There was no succession crisis, no rebellion by disaffected nobles, no attempt by external enemies to exploit the transition period. Edward assumed the crown with universal acceptance, and the work of government continued without interruption. But the deeper significance of Alfred's achievement became clear only in the decades that followed his death. Under Edward and his successors, the military and administrative systems Alfred had created proved capable of sustaining campaigns that gradually extended English rule over all the territories that had been lost to Viking conquest. By 954, the last Viking king in northern England had been expelled, and for the first time since the Roman period, the entire country was united under a single ruler. The cultural foundations Alfred had laid proved equally durable. The schools he had established, the manuscripts he had commissioned, and the traditions of learning he had promoted survived and flourished long after his death. The English language he had helped to develop as a vehicle for serious intellectual discourse became the foundation for a literary tradition that would eventually produce some of the greatest works in world literature. Perhaps most importantly, Alfred had created a model of kingship that balanced the competing demands of military leadership, administrative efficiency, and cultural patronage in ways that set new standards for medieval governance. His example influenced not only his English successors, but also rulers throughout Europe who sought to create stable, prosperous kingdoms in the aftermath of the Viking Age. The epithet "the Great" that history has attached to Alfred's name reflects not merely his military victories or administrative achievements, but the totality of his contribution to English civilization. He is the only English monarch to bear that title, because he alone among English kings faced an existential threat to his people's survival, and not only overcame it, but used the experience to create something stronger and more enduring than what had existed before. In the perspective of more than a millennium, Alfred's reign represents one of the crucial turning points in European history. Without his resistance to the Viking conquest, the unique blend of influences that would eventually produce English culture might never have survived. Without his reforms, the political and administrative foundations that would enable England to play a leading role in medieval European development might never have been established. The king, who had once been reduced to burning cakes in a peasant's cottage, had saved not merely a kingdom, but an entire way of life. In the darkest hour of the Anglo-Saxon period, when foreign conquest seemed inevitable and native resistance appeared hopeless, Alfred had demonstrated that courage, wisdom, and determination could triumph over seemingly insurmountable odds. His legacy was not merely the survival of Wessex, or even the eventual reunification of England, but the preservation of the essential elements of English Christian civilization during its most vulnerable period. The learning he had promoted, the laws he had codified, the institutions he had created, and the example he had set would influence English development for centuries to come. More than any military victory or diplomatic triumph, this cultural achievement ensured Alfred's place among the greatest rulers in human history. He had not merely defended his people against their enemies, he had shown them what they could become. In creating the foundations of a unified, prosperous and learned English kingdom, Alfred had given his successors the tools they needed to build something unprecedented in early medieval Europe. The transformation he had accomplished was so complete that within a generation of his death, the Viking threat that had once seemed so overwhelming had become a memory. The English state he had created proved capable not only of defending itself, but of expanding to encompass territories far beyond the borders of his original kingdom. Yet perhaps Alfred's most remarkable achievement was the way he had retained his humanity throughout the dehumanizing experiences of warfare, exile, and the constant pressure of royal responsibility. The king who emerged from the Somerset marshes was not a hardened autocrat, but a wise and compassionate ruler who understood that true strength came not from the ability to impose one's will, but from the capacity to inspire others to give their best efforts in pursuit of shared goals. This understanding of leadership, learned in the crucible of existential crisis, was perhaps Alfred's greatest gift to future generations. He had shown that even in the darkest circumstances, when all seemed lost and defeat appeared inevitable, the qualities of courage, wisdom, and determination could achieve what brute force alone could never accomplish. As his followers laid Alfred to rest in the church at Winchester, that he had rebuilt and beautified during his reign, they buried not just a king, but the last representative of the old Anglo-Saxon world that had been shattered by the Viking invasions. Yet they also celebrated the birth of something new, a unified English kingdom with the confidence and capability to reclaim its destiny. The epitaph that might best summarize Alfred's achievement can be found in his own words, written in one of the philosophical works he translated during his later years. "I desired to live worthily as long as I lived, and after my life to leave to them that should come after, my memory and good works, in preserving English civilization during its darkest hour and creating the foundations for its future greatness." Alfred had more than fulfilled this modest ambition. He had become what every ruler aspires to be, but few achieve, a king whose reign marked not an end, but a beginning, whose death represented not a loss, but a legacy that would inspire generations yet unborn. In saving England from the Vikings, Alfred had saved far more than a kingdom. He had preserved the possibility of everything that England would eventually become. The boy who had been born into a world of competing kingdoms and constant warfare had grown into the man who created the foundations of English unity and prosperity. The prince who had never been expected to rule had become the king who saved his people's future. The exile who had hidden in the marshes had emerged as the architect of a kingdom that would endure for centuries. In the end, Alfred's greatest victory was not any single battle, but the complete transformation he had accomplished in both his kingdom and himself. The youngest son, who had learned to read poetry from his mother, had become the warrior scholar who proved that learning and fighting prowess could be combined in a single person. The refugee who had burned cakes in a peasant's cottage had demonstrated that true nobility came not from birth or ceremony, but from service to one's people in their hour of greatest need. As the new century dawned over an England that was finally at peace, Alfred's achievements stood as a testament to what could be accomplished when extraordinary circumstances called forth extraordinary leadership. The foundations he had laid, military, administrative, cultural, and spiritual, would prove strong enough to support not only the reunification of England, but its eventual emergence as one of the most powerful and influential kingdoms in medieval Europe. The chroniclers who recorded the events of his reign struggled to find adequate words to describe what Alfred had accomplished. How does one capture, in mere prose, the transformation of a kingdom from the brink of extinction to the threshold of greatness? How does one convey the full significance of a reign that had saved not just a political entity, but an entire way of life? Perhaps the truest measure of Alfred's achievement lay not in any monument or inscription, but in the simple fact that English civilization had survived to be transmitted to future generations. The children who learned to read in the schools he had established, the craftsmen who prospered under the protection of his fortified towns, the farmers who tilled their fields in security thanks to his military reforms, all were living testimonies to the transformation he had accomplished. The visitors who came to Winchester in Alfred's final years found a court that rivaled any in Europe for its combination of military prowess, administrative efficiency, and cultural sophistication. Scholars debated philosophical questions in the same halls where warriors planned campaigns. Merchants from across the known world traded goods in markets protected by the most advanced fortification system of the age. Artists and craftsmen created works that combined traditional Anglo-Saxon techniques with influences drawn from across the Christian world. This synthesis of elements, military and intellectual, traditional and innovative, local and cosmopolitan, represented the essence of Alfred's achievement. He had not merely preserved the old Anglo-Saxon world, but had transformed it into something new and more powerful. The kingdom he left to his successors was recognisably English in its fundamental character, but equipped with the tools and institutions needed to thrive in the changing world of the 10th century. The diplomatic relationships Alfred had cultivated during his reign created a web of alliances that would support English expansion for generations to come. His correspondence with foreign rulers, his careful attention to marriage alliances, and his strategic distribution of gifts and honours had established Wessex as a respected power in European politics. When Edward began his campaigns of reconquest, he would do so with the support of allies who recognised his father's achievements and trusted in English capabilities. The legal precedents Alfred had established would prove equally enduring. His emphasis on written law, fair procedure, and royal responsibility for justice created foundations that would influence English legal development for centuries. The principle that even kings were bound by law, implicit in Alfred's careful attention to legal codes and procedures, would eventually help produce the unique English tradition of constitutional monarchy. But perhaps most significantly, Alfred had created a new understanding of what it meant to be English. The tribal identities that had divided the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, West Saxon, Mercian, Northumbrian, East Anglian, had been subordinated to a larger conception of English nationality that transcended regional differences. This new identity was based not on blood or territory, but on shared values, shared history, and shared commitment to the civilization Alfred had worked so hard to preserve and strengthen. The young men who served in Edward's armies during the Reconquest campaigns thought of themselves not as West Saxons fighting to expand their particular kingdom, but as Englishmen working to liberate their countrymen from foreign rule. This transformation in consciousness was perhaps Alfred's most subtle but most important achievement, creating the psychological foundations that would make possible the political reunification of England. As news of Alfred's death spread throughout Britain and beyond, the reactions revealed how completely his reputation had transcended the boundaries of his own kingdom. In Wales, princes who had acknowledged his overlordship mourned the loss of a protector who had respected their independence while ensuring their security. In Scotland, kings who had dealt with him as equals recognised that Britain had lost its most formidable ruler. Even among the Viking settlements of the Danelaw, Alfred's death was noted with a mixture of relief and respect. These were warriors who had learned through bitter experience to fear English military capabilities and to respect the strategic genius that had created them. Many of the Scandinavian settlers who had made their peace with English rule understood that their own security depended on the stability Alfred had brought to the island. The immediate tasks facing Edward were daunting, but not impossible, thanks to the foundations his father had laid. The military system was strong enough to support sustained campaigns of expansion. The administrative apparatus was sophisticated enough to govern newly conquered territories effectively. Most importantly, the kingdom possessed the confidence that came from proven success, the knowledge that English arms and English leadership had triumphed over the greatest threat their people had ever faced. The systematic campaign that Edward launched to reconquer the Danelaw was in many ways the logical culmination of everything Alfred had accomplished. The fortified towns that served as bases for these operations were built according to principles Alfred had established. The armies that fought these campaigns were organised and equipped according to his reforms. The diplomatic strategies that isolated Viking strongholds and encouraged local uprisings drew on precedents he had created. Yet Edward's campaigns also revealed the true scope of Alfred's achievement. The young king who led English forces into the former kingdoms of Mercia and East Anglia was not merely continuing his father's work, but fulfilling the vision Alfred had articulated during his darkest hours in the Somerset marshes. The dream of a reunified England, which had seemed so impossible during the desperate months of 878, was becoming reality through the application of principles and methods Alfred had developed. The speed and completeness of the English advance surprised even those who had planned it. Viking strongholds that had seemed impregnable fell with startling regularity to armies that combined traditional English courage with innovative tactics and superior organisation. Local populations that had endured decades of foreign rule rose to support the advancing English forces, providing intelligence, supplies and recruits that accelerated the pace of conquest. By 920, less than 25 years after Alfred's death, English rule had been restored throughout the former kingdoms of Mercia and East Anglia. The great fortress cities that had served as Viking administrative centres, Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, Lincoln and Stamford, were once again under English control. Only in Yorkshire did significant Viking resistance remain, and even there the writing was on the wall. The transformation was so complete that many who witnessed it struggled to believe what they were seeing. The political map of Britain that had seemed permanently altered by the Viking conquests was being redrawn with a speed that seemed almost miraculous. Yet those who understood the foundations Alfred had laid recognised that this success was the inevitable result of careful preparation and patient implementation of a coherent strategy. The cultural consequences of reunification were equally dramatic. Monasteries that had been destroyed during the Viking invasions were rebuilt and restocked with manuscripts preserved in Alfred's scriptoriums. Schools were established in the reconquered territories, bringing literacy and learning to populations that had been cut off from English educational developments for generations. The legal and administrative systems that had proven so effective in Wessex were extended throughout the enlarged kingdom. Perhaps most importantly, the process of reconquest created a shared sense of achievement that helped to heal the divisions the Viking invasions had created within English society. Men from all the traditional Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fought side by side in Edward's armies, united by common purpose and inspired by the example Alfred had set. The success of these campaigns validated not only Alfred's military innovations, but also his vision of what the English people could accomplish when they worked together. The death of the last independent Viking king in northern England in 954 marked the formal completion of the reunification process that Alfred had begun. For the first time since the end of Roman rule, the entire country was under unified government. The kingdom that Alfred's great-grandson Edred ruled extended from the English Channel to the Scottish border, encompassing territories that had not been united since the days of the Caesars. Yet the achievement represented more than mere political consolidation. The England of 954 was fundamentally different from any kingdom that had existed on the island before. It possessed military capabilities that could project power throughout northwestern Europe. Its administrative systems were sophisticated enough to govern a large, diverse population effectively. Its cultural institutions were strong enough to absorb and transform foreign influences while maintaining their essential English character. The legal and constitutional principles that would eventually distinguish English governance from continental European models were already beginning to emerge during this period. The emphasis on written law, the importance of royal courts as centres of justice, the concept of the king as protector rather than owner of his subjects, all reflected developments that traced their origins to Alfred's reign. The economic prosperity that characterised 10th century England was similarly rooted in Alfredian foundations. The security provided by the burghal system had encouraged trade and manufacturing to flourish. The administrative efficiency of royal government had ensured that resources could be mobilised effectively for public purposes. The cultural renaissance that Alfred had initiated had attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen from throughout Europe, bringing new skills and techniques that enhanced English productivity. The international respect that the reunified English kingdom commanded reflected not merely its military power, but also the reputation for wisdom and justice that Alfred's reign had established. Foreign rulers who dealt with English kings expected to encounter not merely successful warlords, but sophisticated politicians who understood the complexities of diplomacy and governance. This reputation would prove crucial as England began to play an increasingly important role in European affairs. The kingdom that had once struggled merely to survive Viking invasion was becoming a major power whose support was sought by rulers throughout northwestern Europe. The diplomatic marriages, military alliances, and commercial relationships that characterised 10th century English foreign policy all built upon precedents Alfred had established. The Norse settlements that remained within the reunified kingdom were gradually absorbed into English society through processes that reflected Alfred's understanding of how former enemies could become productive subjects. Rather than attempting to eliminate Scandinavian influence entirely, English policy encouraged assimilation through intermarriage, conversion to Christianity, and adoption of English legal and administrative practices. This inclusive approach created a stronger, more diverse society that combined the best elements of both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian traditions. The military effectiveness that had made the Vikings such formidable enemies was channeled into service for the English crown. The commercial networks that connected Scandinavian settlements to markets throughout northern Europe became assets of the English kingdom. The cultural vitality that characterised Viking society enriched English artistic and intellectual development. The religious foundations that Alfred had established proved equally important in the reunified kingdom. The monasteries at Athelney and Shaftesbury became models for new religious houses throughout the reconquered territories. The emphasis on learning and scholarship that had characterised Alfred's court was transmitted to a new generation of religious leaders who helped to restore the intellectual life that had been disrupted by the Viking invasions. The manuscript collections that had been preserved in Alfred's scriptoriums provided the basis for a cultural renaissance that would make 10th century England one of the leading centres of learning in Europe. The traditions of historical writing that had produced the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle were continued and expanded, creating a record of English achievement that would inspire and inform future generations. The architectural achievements of the period reflected both the prosperity that reunification had brought and the confidence that success had generated. The churches, palaces, and fortifications built during the 10th century combined traditional English techniques with innovations borrowed from throughout Europe, creating a distinctive style that expressed the unique character of the reunified kingdom. Perhaps most significantly, the England that emerged from the reunification process possessed a sense of identity and purpose that transcended the tribal loyalties and regional divisions that had weakened earlier Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The shared experience of conquest, resistance, and ultimate triumph had created bonds of national unity that would prove strong enough to withstand the challenges of subsequent centuries. This transformation in consciousness was Alfred's most lasting contribution to English development. By demonstrating that the English people could overcome seemingly impossible odds when they worked together under effective leadership, he had created a foundation of national confidence that would support English achievements for generations to come. The military traditions that trace their origins to Alfred's reforms would influence English warfare for centuries. The administrative principles he had established would evolve into the governmental systems that would make England one of the most effectively governed kingdoms in medieval Europe. The legal precedents he had set would contribute to the development of the common law tradition that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. The cultural achievements of Alfred's reign would provide inspiration for the literary and artistic renaissance that would make medieval England a centre of European intellectual life. The educational institutions he had founded would evolve into the universities and schools that would train the administrators, diplomats, and scholars who would extend English influence throughout the known world. But beyond all these specific achievements, Alfred had accomplished something even more important. He had demonstrated that catastrophic defeat could be transformed into ultimate triumph through the application of courage, wisdom, and determination. The king, who had been reduced to hiding in the marshes, had shown that no situation was hopeless as long as people were willing to fight for their principles and work toward their goals. This lesson would prove crucial in the trials that lay ahead for the English people. The Norman conquest of 1066 would challenge everything that Alfred's successors had built, yet the foundations he had laid proved strong enough to absorb and transform even this massive disruption. The administrative systems, legal traditions, and cultural institutions he had established would survive the conquest and eventually reshape the society the Normans had tried to impose. The exploration and colonization that would spread English influence throughout the world during later centuries drew on principles and precedents that Alfred had established. The combination of military effectiveness, administrative efficiency, and cultural adaptability that had enabled Wessex to survive and prosper would prove equally effective in very different environments and circumstances. The constitutional traditions that would eventually make England the birthplace of parliamentary democracy traced their origins to concepts of law and governance that Alfred had articulated during his reign. The idea that even kings were bound by law, that justice should be accessible to all subjects, and that government existed to serve the people rather than to exploit them, all reflected principles that could be found in Alfred's legal codes and administrative practices. Yet for all his historical importance, Alfred remained essentially human in his motivations and methods. The king who saved English civilization was not a remote, mythical figure, but a man who had learned his most important lessons from personal experience of suffering and loss. The wisdom that enabled him to transform his kingdom came not from abstract study, but from practical engagement with the challenges and opportunities of his time. This human dimension of Alfred's achievement makes his example particularly relevant for later generations. The problems he faced, foreign invasion, internal division, economic disruption, cultural decay, have confronted many societies throughout history. The methods he used to address these challenges, military innovation, administrative reform, educational advancement, cultural renewal remain applicable to very different circumstances and times. The legacy Alfred left to his successors was not merely a stronger kingdom, but a proven demonstration that human intelligence, courage, and determination could triumph over seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The transformation he had accomplished in his own lifetime showed what could be achieved when principled leadership was combined with effective organization and sustained effort. As we drift toward peaceful sleep, contemplating the remarkable life of this extraordinary king, we can take comfort in the knowledge that Alfred's example continues to inspire those who face their own impossible challenges. The boy who learned to love learning from his mother's poetry books grew into the man who proved that scholarship and warfare, wisdom and courage could be combined in service of the highest ideals. The prince who was never meant to rule became the king who saved his people's future. The exile who hid in the marshes emerged as the architect of English unity. The warrior who faced the Vikings in desperate battle also became the scholar who preserved the learning they threatened to destroy. In the end, Alfred's greatest achievement was not any single victory, but the complete transformation he accomplished of his kingdom, his people, and himself. He had taken a society on the brink of extinction and given it the tools it needed not merely to survive, but to flourish. He had turned defeat into victory, despair into hope, division into unity. The epithet, the Great, that history has granted to Alfred reflects not merely the scale of his achievements, but their lasting significance. He stands alone among English monarchs in bearing this title because he alone among them faced an existential threat to his people's survival, and not only overcame it, but used the experience to create something stronger and more enduring than what had existed before. In saving England from the Vikings, Alfred had saved far more than a kingdom. He had preserved the possibility of everything that England would eventually become. The foundations he laid would support not only the reunification of his island, but the eventual extension of English influence throughout the world. The principles he established would evolve into the legal and constitutional traditions that would make England the birthplace of modern democracy. But perhaps most importantly, Alfred had shown that in the darkest hours, when all seems lost and defeat appears inevitable, the human spirit can still triumph through the application of courage, wisdom, and unwavering determination. The king who learned to burn cakes in a peasant's cottage had become the man who proved that no challenge is insurmountable when faced with the right combination of intelligence, courage, and faith. As you close your eyes and drift into peaceful slumber, let the example of Alfred the Great remind you that every ending can become a new beginning. Every defeat can contain the seeds of future victory, and every crisis can become an opportunity for those with the wisdom to see beyond immediate circumstances to the possibilities that lie ahead. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of the boy who became a king, the exile who became a conqueror, the warrior who became a scholar, and the man who proved that with enough courage, wisdom, and determination, any dream, no matter how impossible it might seem, can eventually become reality. Alfred the Great, the king who saved England, rests now in the peaceful sleep of those who have completed their appointed tasks and left the world a better place than they found it. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the same quiet confidence that enabled Alfred to transform catastrophic defeat into ultimate triumph, showing all who came after him that no challenge is too great for those who dare to face it with courage, wisdom, and unshakable faith in the possibility of a better tomorrow. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the remarkable life of Alfred the Great. If you enjoyed this peaceful tale of courage, wisdom, and triumph, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Sleepy Crown for more soothing historical adventures. Sweet dreams, dear listener. And may you always remember that even in the darkest hours, greatness awaits those who have the courage to pursue it.